When Daniel was born, I remember holding him in the hospital and I'm thinking, gotta get my act together now.
He did a lot of drugs, he drank a lot.
When your child starts to do drugs, you often blame yourself and wonder, what did I do wrong? What could I have done different?
For the first time, I knew a minister really cared.
God, how can you take my child at this point in my life? And he said, he's mine now. Ever since Daniel was a very small child, there was always a glow about him.
And when I moved to South Carolina, it was just, a whole new world. I mean, I'm going to school with kids from other cultures, and even though it's the South and it was still pretty racist, I was exposed to those kind of things.
And when he began his drug period, there was just a complete and total darkness that surrounded my child.
The kids in my neighborhood, we started just smoking and drinking, and 11 years old, and I remember smoking pot for the first time about that same time.
Did a lot of drugs together, sold a lot of drugs together.
With all these older kids that were doing stuff, and I started experimenting with drugs, and before a couple years went by, it was completely a full-blown addiction.
I mean, you could look in his eyes, and they were literally black and sunk in the back of his head.
I just remember sitting on this log in the woods and just thinking, there's no point to life whatsoever. And why would I even want to continue living this life? And I remember putting the gun in my mouth and pulling the trigger. And the next thing you know, I'm waking up.
When Daniel was born, I was pretty wild. I was doing a lot of drugs and drinking, and I've changed a lot. I've settled down a lot, but I was still kind of wild. And then when Daniel was born, I remember holding him in the hospital and I'm thinking, man, gotta get my act together now. I mean, I'm responsible for him and I'm his protector. And, so everything's gotta change.
And I remember looking out the little jail cell window and only allowed outside of our cell 1 hour a day. And then they looked out this window and there was this man, this elderly gentleman, walking from cell to cell with a box of books. And I watched him and I thought, he must be like the librarian. And so when he got to my cell, I was like, cool, I'm going to have some pass the time, some cool mafia story, or I'll read a romance novel, I'm so bored. It doesn't matter. And when he got to my cell, I reached into this box and I pulled out this book of sex, crime, deception, murder, this crazy book, but it was actually the Bible. And I started reading the Bible for the very first time in my entire life. And I'm reading these stories in the Old Testament where it's like the earth is opening up and eating people. There's a flood that's just, destroying everybody except for this one guy and his family on this boat with all these animals. And it was just hard to wrap my mind around it. And I remember this guy that was in jail with me, his name was Ray, and he was a drug dealer. But he had become a Christian before he came to jail. And his grandmother had given him her Bible. And he had this giant Bible. And so I started asking him all these questions, like, Ray, what about Adam and Eve and Noah? Why is God killing people? And, I've stolen a lot of things, and this guy stole one thing and God killed his whole family. And I said, is God going to kill me? This is what I was thinking. And I had all these questions, and finally he goes, listen, you just need to give your heart to Jesus. And I'm like, what? I was like, there's no way. How do you do that? I mean, you have open heart surgery. What does that look like? And so finally he's like, no, you just pray this prayer. So I'm like, cool, I have nothing to lose. Let's just do it. So I prayed this little prayer, staring at the stainless steel toilet in the county jail. And at 2:00 in the morning, I got out of jail because it wasn't a serious offense. And instead of calling anybody to pick me up, something told me inside to start walking home. Now, it's pretty crazy because it's literally 15 miles or more to my house from the county jail. And so it's 2 a.m, I begin walking. And I'm just walking. Well, I walk for 2 hours. Halfway home, God speaks to me. And it wasn't like this booming voice, like, Daniel, this is God. There was no light. There was no little angels floating around, or the Hallelujah chorus didn't go off, none of that. But it was just like I had this reality that God was speaking to me, and I knew it. And it wasn't even like he was saying anything specific. I just knew in my heart that I had to make a choice. It was either life or death. And I had already OD'd, I'd already been in, near-death experiences, a lot of those, so I thought, I'm gonna die. So I told God in the middle of the road, I'm just like, God, if you're really real and you're talking to me right now in this moment, and I'm not going crazy, I'm a drug addict, God. These just voices that I'm hearing, or if you're really talking to me, I'll give you my entire life, but you've got to help me.
He got out of jail, and he was walking home, and he came home all excited, and he said, I've been saved. I asked God to come into my life, and he did. And it was 180. He was completely different. And I'm thinking, okay, let's see how long this lasts. Let's really see how long this lasts. And I was skeptical at first, but then the thing that really touched me the most was he went on a mission trip, and he came back, and he had us take his bed out of his room. I said, why don't you want your bed? He says, I went to the Dominican Republic. These people don't have beds. Why should I be any different? Why should I be better than them? And I thought, man, that's just great. It's awesome. And I knew right then he had changed. I knew it.
I think the thing that really impacted me the most was involved in youth. There's just lights, and there's music, and there's kids going everywhere. And no matter what was going on, whether it was a good day or a bad day, if there was something that I needed help with, I could go and I could say, hey, Daniel, my mother-in-law's not doing good. And it would be 5 minutes till 7, and the service started at 7, and kids are coming up and asking questions, and Daniel would stop and grab me, and he'd say, well, let's just pray. And he would grab me and pull me close, and in the midst of all that, I vividly remember, you could see the lights, you could hear all the sound, but it was like everything just kind of was quiet in our own little world. And for the first time, I knew a minister really cared.
One day, my pastor and I were having a conversation, and I just began to cry in the middle of this conversation in his office. And I just looked at him and said, I can't do this anymore. I can't continue to share and disciple and reach out to youth of America when there's literally children and people are suffering all around the world, and people have not even heard about Jesus in some places in the world. And I said, I'm done. And he goes, what are you going to do? I said, I have no idea. But I remember resigning in that moment, and that was when the housing market crashed. And so he's like, well, at least give me an idea what you want to do so we can help you process it. And so I invited a few mentors to a meeting, and in the middle of the meeting, one of my mentors asked me, he said, I think you're supposed to come to Malaysia and help take over my organization. I'm looking for a younger man to take over my organization. Why don't you come out and see, what happens? And so I didn't even know where Malaysia was. I had to get the world map out and go, okay, Malaysia is there above Singapore. And I put my house on the market the next day.
And I said, God, how can you take my child at this point in my life? And he said, do you remember when Daniel used to jump around like that because he was on drugs? And I said, absolutely. And he said, he's mine now. And I said, okay. And I, of course, as a mother, continued to cry. And a few minutes later, Daniel was on the ground worshiping and just pouring his heart out to God. And I said, look, God, look what a good kid this is now. How can you take him from us? And he said, do you remember when you used to find your child laying on the ground because he was so high on drugs that he didn't have any control of his body? And I said, yes, Lord. And he said, he's mine now. And from that point on, I was just okay with it. I don't care where they go. I know they're covered in the blood. I know they're going to be saved. And I know that we went through everything that we went through to bring him to this point.
And I sold everything for pennies on the dollar. and moved to Asia with a backpack on my back. Over that course of the past 3 years while being based in Malaysia, I think I've been to something like 16 or more nations, just doing leadership development, working mainly with indigenous leaders in those countries and helping to empower local leaders and training missionaries, and just done so many amazing things and seen so many amazing miracles.
He makes it so clear that the gospel is inclusive. It goes beyond boundaries of churched and unchurched, or saved and unsaved. It goes beyond boundaries of culture.
One day I said, Daniels, you know a lot of people, can you get me a job? And he said to me, why not you pray to your God and He gave you a job? And I told him I prayed every single day to get a job, and a lot of struggling, so God didn't answer. And he said, okay, let me try to pray for you, see my God answer or not. Because of that, I'm here today, and I'm ready to share love of Jesus with people.
He knew that God had a purpose for us, and He's got a purpose for everybody.
And that is something, that's a valuable life lesson that I just think that I don't think I can ever have learned in any other way.
After I seen the way God transformed Daniel's life, I was ready to check this out too.
And so I've never even had to raise support. And so it's just been this, people find out what I'm doing and they want to get involved, or God tells them to do this. And so it's just been so amazing to see how God provides. And Matthew 6 says, don't worry about anything, you know, and He's going to take care of the birds. He'll take care of you. Well, the plan for Thailand is pretty simple. We're moving there to incorporate ourselves into the community that's existing there already, and we're going to love them, we're going to listen to them, and we're going to learn from them, and we're just going to see what happens.